For decades, we've been told that the only way to get great images is to shoot at low ISOs. And while that's true in theory, the game has changed. And we can now actually shoot at absurdly high ISOs in the field and still get beautiful, basically noise-free and clean images. The emergence of programs like DXO, Puro and Topaz DeNoise have made it possible to shoot at very high ISOs and still get those clean files. But which one of the two programs is the right one? And how can you effectively denoise your own images? Since Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw do a relatively poor job of dealing with the noise in all the modern cameras like A1, Z9, R3, R5, etc., it has become an important first step for me to run these high ISO files through Pure Raw first. So let me show you how you can deal with those files. So like always, the process of looking for the right image to edit starts in Fast on Image Viewer for me, where we can just really quickly scroll through all the images and find the one that we like the best. I find that to be a very helpful program. You can also zoom in all the way to 100%, hold the mouse button down and then use the mouse wheel to scroll through all images at 100%. One image in particular that stands out to me is this one. I just love the stare on its face, but I didn't use any flash or anything, so it's a little bit dark. Definitely has a good amount of noise in it, but the bright background allows us to hopefully deal with the noise pretty easily, and then we will need to work on the image a bit, lighten up the eyes, lighten up the throat a little bit. So the first step we need to do in my new workflow is to run this image through Pure Raw. And I can basically just drag this image directly from Fast on Image Viewer into Pure Raw. When it comes to the preferences, there's really not much to set up. I usually like to run it off my pretty good graphics card because it runs a little bit faster, but if you don't have a good graphic card, it's probably best to just leave it on auto. So then we just select the image and go to Process Photo. What we want to use is Deep Prime, and then I turn off the lens sharpening because Pure Raw just over sharpens the images, and I also turn off the lens distortion correction because that also doesn't do things that I like. It kind of just warps the image a little bit and makes the edges brighter, which is also not what I need. Then I wanted to put an output at DNG, and I just drop it into a custom folder on my desktop. I put all the DNGs in this folder because you will see later through the editing process that I don't actually need those files. So whenever I'm finished editing the image, I can go to that DNG folder on my desktop and delete all the DNGs that I worked on that day because I will not need them, and it just saves me a lot of disk space. So then all we need to click is Process, and there we go. It took about 20 seconds to run this one image. So for some of you, especially if you have your slower computer, this can take a minute or more. So what you can do, you don't have to run just one image at a time. You can also just put in all the images that you want to edit on that day, and then just press start, come back an hour later or something, have a cup of coffee. And then from here, I like to directly open them up in Photoshop. So I can click Export to, and I can select Photoshop and then directly import this DNG into Photoshop. And then we'll open this in Camera Raw. One thing you notice with DXO Pure Raw, for some reason, it makes your RAW files a little bit darker, which is annoying. But when we zoom into this file, we can see that we've gotten rid of a lot of the noise, and it's much more pleasant and less noisy to look at. So the first thing I need to do now is pick a profile, and I like to use my own presets that I've made with Glenn on the bird photography show. These are very helpful. One of my favorite ones is the vibrant more contrast, so I'll put that on. You can instantly see it helps me bring out a little bit more details. And then because this image is so dark, I'll need to up the exposure a lot, probably by 1.4 stops. I want to lift the shadows a little bit. I pull back the highlights. I add a bit of vibrance. And then I think the overall image is a little bit too green, so I'm adding a bunch of magenta to the file. So this is looking pretty good. The last thing we might want to do now is do some sharpening. When we zoom into here, probably don't need much sharpening, but a little bit would be good. When you open Photoshop, this usually looks like this, but when you can see there's a little arrow down here on the right with the sharpening, which is pretty handy because we can stop it from actually sharpening the background. So if we put a crazy amount of sharpening, you can see that now there's a lot of sharpening in the background. But if I pull this masking and hold down the Alt key, you can see the areas that turn black that will not be sharpened now. So if I go to around 50%, for instance, you see the bird is still sharp, but there's a lot less noise and over sharpened background elements now. So if we go back, for instance, you can see how this is over sharpened, and then with the masking, now only the bird is sharpened. Obviously, we don't want to do so much. I like to run a radius of like 0.5, pull the sharpening back a little bit as well. And then we click open and open it in Photoshop. And so with a few clicks, we were able to get rid of the majority of the noise. From here, I'll run my normal editing workflow where I'll select the background so I can treat the bird and the background individually. And then I work on the bird's face in particular because I want to make the eyes stand out. I want to make the throat a little bit brighter. I want to work on the bright areas on the cheeks, and then I think I will end up with a beautiful final looking image. And all of these steps I also teach you in my masterclass, where I show you exactly my editing process and all the necessary steps you need to take to make your images look absolutely amazing. So if that's of interest to you, make sure to check it out down there in the description. So this is now my final edited image. On the right here you can see all the layers that I used. So first I removed all the dirt from the bird's face. Then I brightened the background a little bit. Then I brightened the eyes and part of the belly. Then I darkened the black areas for more impact. Brightened some of the other areas. Put some more red into the eyes. Removed the bright patch in the background. Remove the color out of these white patches so they look more nice and clean and we get more perceived sharpness in the image. Then I gave some saturation overall. Removed some saturation out of the black and gave some more saturation in here. Run an overall levels adjustment. I ran a white neutralizer on it, and then I ran a Nik Pro contrast on it as well, and I got to this final looking image. Now you might find yourself in a situation where you say, this image is still too noisy. I run it through Pure Raw, but when I zoom in, I can still see a bit of grain that I don't really like. And this is where Topaz DeNoise comes in for me, because it can do a good job at this late stage in removing the noise. So let me show you how I use Topaz to now make this nice looking file even smoother. The first thing we need to do when we want to run Topaz is create a new layer. I do that by pressing Ctrl Shift Alt and E. I always run Topaz on a separate layer because it sometimes does things that I don't want it to do. And if I run it on a separate layer, I can use the layer mask to just remove it, for instance, where it does too much noise reduction. I want to bring back a little bit more detail. So running Topaz on a different layer is always a very good idea. So now I'm on my separate layer. I go Filters, Topaz, Topaz DeNoise. You might find as well that Topaz is a pretty slow program, but there's one way to at least speed up the editing, and that's if you go File, Preferences, and here you select your graphic cards instead of your CPU, and will dramatically increase the speed that Topaz runs at. When it comes to noise reduction with Topaz, I usually choose these settings and the severe noise. Because I run it on a separate layer, I can always run it quite intensive and then remove it with a layer mask if I think it's done too much. The slider you want to play around in particular with is the recover original detail, because the less you recover, the more smooth your background will be, for instance. But usually these settings here work pretty well for me. So that took maybe 6 or 7 seconds. Here we still see that little bit of noise that we wanted to get rid of. And now you can see how Topaz got rid of almost all the remaining noise. But at the same time, I feel like it got rid of a little bit too much detail up here and some detail in the whites and on the blacks. And especially in an area like that doesn't have much detail because of the depth of field, Topaz got rid of basically everything. So what I want to do now is I create a layer mask by going down here and click on it. That creates a white layer mask. What I do now, I use my brush, 30%, 25% opacity. I put the color to black. And now when I paint over these areas, I can bring back a little bit of the noise to make it look more natural and not have these weirdly smooth looking areas. So I do that wherever I feel like Topaz has done too much denoising. A little bit around the eyes. And there we go. I think that's a pretty great looking final result with almost no noise in the file anymore. So what I've done with Topaz just now, you can obviously also do without Pure Raw. But then the result would actually be more noisy, and I find it more difficult to do it that way. So I like to use Pure Raw to get rid of all the noise initially And if there's some remaining noise left in the image, then I run Topaz. With Topaz, you just have to be aware that what I just showed you, that it sometimes likes to run too much noise reduction in certain areas. So if you run it on a separate layer and you use the layer mask with a brush to brush back some of that noise into your image, you will end up with some great looking results. You don't want to have your images too smooth. This is probably more noise reduction than I would run on a file like this, but running Topaz on this file is a great example how actually using DXO Pure and Topaz together is actually a very strong 1-2 punch. Having both is the ultimate, I'd say, but the one I couldn't really live without, at the moment at least, is Pure. So with DXO Pure to get rid of the initial noise, my ProSets and Camera Raw to quickly give me great colors and a good starting point, and then my workflow that I teach you in the masterclass, I feel like I'm very well equipped to tackle any situation and very high ISO files. So there's really no excuse anymore to not use high ISOs in the field, and I think it's actually quite advantageous. Of course, using low ISOs is always better and gives you even better image quality, but I always say a noisy image is much better than a blurry image because I can fix the noise, but I cannot fix any motion blur. So personally, I always choose to shoot at higher ISOs to maintain a good enough shutter speed that prevents me from getting blurry images, because I know that I can later on deal with the noise in the editing process. And this has been truly game changing for me. I can now shoot in a dark rainforest, have a small fast bird, shoot at ISO 25,600 for instance, have a decent enough shutter speed and get a good shot. Personally, I think that's much better than shooting at like a 60th of a second at ISO 800. How have you been going with shooting at high ISO and running noise reduction on your images? Is that something you were a little bit scared of? If you were, hopefully this video has helped you to gain more of an insight in how to deal with these high ISO files, and you can now go out and shoot high ISO files and don't get blurry images. So like always, share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Give me a thumbs up for the video, it really helps me with the algorithm. Check out my masterclass and ProSets down in the description. Also, subscribe to the channel and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye guys.